Hello everybody and welcome to my show, where today I shall be talking to author and also past editor of Gnostic magazine, Richard Smoley. And today we're going to be discussing his new book, A New Theology of Love. Thank you for coming and talking to me, Richard.
Yes, it's a pleasure to be here. The book is, by the way, called just A Theology of Love.
Oh, is it? A Theology of Love? Right. Okay, then I've probably got a new book, too many news. But it's a fantastic book. I did enjoy reading it. It covers a lot of different subjects on the things of love, because obviously love is quite an underlying thing in many religions. But it's sort of coming from perhaps a Christian point of view, would you say?
Well, it's an attempt to reconfigure Christian theology, because conventional Christian theology doesn't really make any sense. We are supposed to believe that God got mad at the human race because somebody ate a piece of fruit at some point and condemned everybody to hell. And then he sent some part of himself down here to be tortured to death, somehow made it all right. Except if you don't really believe that, you're still damned to hell. I mean, that really makes no sense. I mean, there are profound liturgies and all sorts of artworks, that elaborate this theme and seem to make it acceptable, but it doesn't really make any sense. It makes less sense than ordinary human reason, and that can't be true. Christianity has long hidden under this veil of taking something on faith. Well, this is true. And by the way, there's a certain kind of hammer on the other end, because as I said, if you don't believe it, you're going to fry in hell. So it's hidden its logical inconsistencies behind a lot of liturgy, behind a lot of veiled and not so veiled threats. And it simply doesn't make any sense. And the educated world has pretty much woken up to this fact. That is to say, this Christian theology has very, very little allegiance in the world of the certainly English-speaking intelligentsia. I think that's true in Britain, and I think it's true here. So what can be done with this? Well, can you chuck it? Can you just throw it all out? Well, you can, but as someone once said, those who do not believe in God, do not believe in nothing, they're likely to believe in anything. And over the last 100 years or so, we've seen the profusion of all these ideologies. Some of them, like fascism and communism, were disproved very quickly by just palpably failing. Another is scientific materialism. And scientific materialism pretends to be intellectually triumphant, but its consequences have become rather alarming, if only in terms of the environmental damage it's done, which are a consequence of the scientific materialistic worldview, in my view, and not a side effect of it, not just a mere offshoot of it. These are the direct consequences of this kind of mentality. So at the same time, we live in a world, we in the West live in a world that has been shaped by Christianity, and many of its ideas, many of its thoughts are still in the background of our minds. So what can be done with it? And in this book, I'm attempting to reconstrue it to some degree. Not because Christianity is superior to any other religion, and I don't believe it is. I don't think it has any exclusive claim on truth, but it is part of our cultural background. And I think it would do well for us to deal with it somehow in an intellectually satisfying way, a theologically satisfying way, and an emotionally satisfying way.
Well, that's one of the things I liked about your book. It wasn't just about Christianity. You cover quite a few things in it. For example, Kabbalah, and I think it was a little bit of Hinduism, if I remember rightly. I like Kabbalah myself, so I was quite drawn to them. And some Gurdjieff, which always gets a big thumbs up from me. But you've got it kind of based on the Course of Miracles. Their symbology, well, not symbology, their syllabus is the word I'm looking for. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and it's largely because A Course in Miracles does present the only logically consistent Christian theology that I've ever come across, and possibly the only one that's ever been created in the 2,000 years since Christianity was founded. Now, pretty much all serious scholars believe that the New Testament, the Gospels of the New Testament, and the other Gospels as well, the ones that are not in the New Testament, contain some things that Jesus said and did, and some things that he didn't say or do, but were added on later. Now, there is no scholarly consensus about this, absolutely none. You go from the evangelical, the fundamentalists who believe every last word of it, even the parts that are mutually inconsistent, down to people who believe that Jesus was simply kind of a mocked up pagan, dying and resurrected God, cooked up by somebody somewhere. We don't know who. There's no evidence for these people who would have cooked up this God or not. But that's kind of the ultimate in skepticism. I am willing to be somewhere in the middle and say, yeah, the basic historical structure of that there was a man named Jesus who lived around AD 30, was crucified in that time in Judea, and whose disciples had some experience of having him appear to them after his death. This is not quite as bizarre as it may sound, because I know for a fact, and have been told by many people, and have maybe some experience of it myself, of having people have dead friends and relatives appear to them just after their death. This is incredibly common. Why is it not known about? Because people don't talk about it, because they're afraid their friends and relatives will think they're crazy, which they will. But now, was this experience of the risen Jesus the same, different, or sort of the same? That we can't say, because we have almost no firsthand account of anyone saying, I had this experience of the risen Jesus, except by the Apostle Paul, who basically said, yeah, well, he appeared to me too. And that's all. All of the stuff in the Gospels and the Acts were written by third parties who weren't there, right? Nobody who knew Jesus personally wrote anything in the New Testament as we have it now. As far as this is pretty much standard scholarly opinion. So we're dealing with second and third hand accounts. So whether there's anything in there that's historically accurate, what did Jesus say? I mean, he keeps telling the disciples, you're not understanding me. So we have to assume that, some of this misunderstanding was transmitted on very, very early and kind of mutated into the kind of Christianity I've been speaking about. Now, A Course in Miracles is an extremely strange text. It's a channeled work, meaning that the person who actually wrote it down on paper did not claim to be the author, did not think she was the author, and was simply taking dictation from a voice. And this voice, according to the voice itself, was that of Jesus Christ himself. And this woman, Helen Schuckman, was a psychologist at the Columbia University School of Medicine in New York. And she thought she was going crazy. And she confided to a colleague that she was hearing this voice. And she says, I think I'm going crazy. And her colleague said, well, you don't really display any of the clinical signs of, madness. So what should I do? She said, well, why don't you just write down what it says? And starts by saying, this is A Course in Miracles. Please take notes. And she did. And her associate was a man named Bill Thetford, helped her type up these notes, and 1,200 pages, and about 10 years later, the whole thing came out. It was privately published and rapidly got an enormous following. Now, do I personally believe that this was dictated by Jesus Christ himself? I don't know. Helen Schuckman herself said, I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. But the voice does have some real authority and is worth listening to. And that's the position I take. And this Course in Miracles has a theology, which, as I say, if you grant its basic premises, is logical and sensible. There are no contradictions, there are no appeals to faith. If you follow its premises along quite logically, they all make sense. And that's why I think it's worth listening to. And many other people agree, because there's been about 3 million copies sold worldwide since it was published in 1975 without any advertising. And I believe it's been translated now into 27 languages. So it's not just me that thinks this. And its influence is obviously very broad, but it's had very little influence in the Christian world proper, because it's just written off as a heresy. There's a thing called the naming fallacy. You label something and therefore you think you've explained it. And in Christian theology, this takes the form of labeling something as error. This is nothing more than the old Gnostic heresy, which somebody supposedly refuted centuries ago, although it turns out often enough they didn't. And that's kind of where it's been relegated to in conventional Christian theology. But Christian theology is very close to being dead. Very, very close to being dead. I mean, as you probably have heard, there's talk of simply having it written out of the universities for the simple reason that is it really at this point any kind of serious intellectual inquiry? Well, not really. Often because it's based on kind of inconsistencies that I've already told on. How is this an intellectual discipline? Is it going to be thrown out of the universities? I rather doubt it, because the great universities, including Oxford and Cambridge to begin with, started as theological schools, and they're probably not going to, take the step of chucking it entirely, but it's very much sidelined. And yet, without a theology, people are lost. A theology is, it's not optional. You will have a theology whether you want one or not, because even to believe in nothing is to have a set of beliefs about God and the universe. And if you believe in nothing, if you believe that it's all just like this horrible, bizarre accident, it's going to have consequences in your life. Moreover, everybody knows deep down that that isn't true. It's simply false. And, the rationalist convinces himself that it's true. The kind of selfish materialist convinces himself it's true because he wants to get away with anything. But deep down inside, we know it isn't. Yes, there is something real. As Thornton Wilder said in an old play called Our Town, everybody knows that there's something that's eternal, and that something has to do with human beings. And if that's the case, it's in our own interest to kind of encounter that, and we have to, of course, encounter it in ourselves. If our life is going to have any meaning, if we're not going to just stagger around, at the mercies of whatever fear happens to be circulating this week. So that's kind of my interest, of course, in miracles.
Well, it's something I've been quite concerned about lately. I've been hearing rumours that they're going to try and stop or drop theological courses. I myself have a degree in divinity, and I can, I went because I wanted to learn about theology and how theology works, and I've always had an interest in it. It's, I know it's not a spiritual practice itself, the degree, but it helped me with my spiritual practice. Mm-hmm. So it would be a shame if they do try and stop it, but I do seem to see there is a lot of university or talk of getting rid of the arts, which is what theology would come under. So,
well, yeah, I mean, I went to Oxford, and it seemed then, and it still seems now, that the official religion at Oxford is basically an agnosticism, atheism disguising itself as agnosticism. We don't know whether there's a God, but we kind of really do. We really know there isn't. And of course, there are these lovely old clergymen and vicars around, and all of these buildings of ours are named after saints and Our Lady and Christ. So kind of have to leave them around, if only for the sake of tradition. But it seems to be no cash value, so to speak. That was true in 1979, and I see nothing to make me believe it's different now. The United States, it's different for various reasons, but I would say that even also at the great universities here, that is basically the kind of intellectual status quo.
Well, with your book, I thought it was a fantastic way of putting forward theology for not just for Christians, it's for all kinds of people, or even atheists would probably get a lot from it of learning. Because I think in this day and age with rationalism and things, people have forgotten how to be loving themselves, to their God, or to finding a spiritual path to something. Would you agree with something like that?
Yeah.
I'm just going to turn the light on while you answer.
Yeah.
Suddenly got really dark out.
Yeah. Yes. Part of the reason this has become so difficult is, well, as you know, there are categories of moral development. I mean, this is standard psychology. The lowest level of moral development is fear of the policeman, right? You're only doing it because you might get caught and go to jail. A slightly higher level of moral development is, well, it's kind of expected, and I want to seem like a good person, and most people are at the mercy of wanting to seem like a good person. Gurdjieff called this internal considering, right? Mm-hmm. There is a higher level of altruism, of wishing sincerely and trying to achieve the highest good, but without any kind of basis in belief. It's just kind of an instinct. And it's true, many people who are atheists and agnostics have this intuition, this altruism, far more than many people who are religious. So it's not simply a matter of religion. And religion sometimes gets in the way, as we've unfortunately seen. But I would say that, but to put it somewhat simply, this something eternal has something to do with human beings, and collectively and individually. So in a sense, to use a very, very hackneyed expression, yes, we are all one, but not in some kind of vague, mushy sense, but rather in the sense that that which is most deeply I, Gurdjieff's true I, is precisely what we share with everyone else. And that is why there's this myth, which is a universal one, of the cosmic human. That is one being who shattered into all sorts of little tiny pieces, which are you and I running around, seemingly at odds with each other. And this is not true. I mean, in a metaphysical sense, it's not true. It appears to be true on this level. But because there's something fundamentally false about it, it's unsatisfying, it's illusory, and it makes us unhappy. What is one of the most common things you hear in all of the mystical traditions? This world is illusory. What you're seeing is not really what's there. And this is so counterintuitive, so contrary to everything that our senses appear to be telling us at every moment, that is very, very hard to accept. And even a spiritually sensitive person is kind of willing to say, yeah, I can kind of understand this, but it's very hard to grasp, emotionally or completely. But if we do have this sense of this kind of fundamental oneness, life should become much easier, because suddenly, you're not running around in a forest of enemies the way you are in common perception of ordinary life. And therefore, kindness, altruism, love, compassion come much more naturally. And as you well know, these things only really work and succeed when they come naturally. If they come from a sense of should, have to, must, what the neighbors think my screwed up idea of what a good person is. Usually it just goes wrong anyway. And the novels, plays, movies of the world are filled with instances of this, as is unfortunately real life. But, and one of the things the Course in Miracles is saying is, well, this is, there's a line, I trust my brothers who are one with me. And this, yes, this is very difficult to grasp. It is not true on a superficial, materialistic level, but at another level it is true. And the more we connect with that truth, the more satisfying our lives will be.
Well, sometimes it's difficult for people when they do perhaps go into this kind of thing, suddenly want to be loving, or they find a new way of expressing love and loving everybody, that not everybody gives it back. I think that's what a lot of people have difficulties with, but then we have to then consider that then other people that haven't quite got the message yet, when they have, they will change themselves, hopefully.
Well, I wrote a book called Conscious Love about this book I'm talking about again is Theology of Love. But my book Conscious Love contrasted what I call transactional love with, to use a phrase from Gurdjieff, conscious love. And Gurdjieff says, love of body is based on type, love of emotion evokes the opposite in response, conscious love evokes its like. And this emotional love, why would it, as Gurdjieff says, evoke the opposite? Well, one answer is that usually it involves some kind of expectation. Your love, your affection, your kindness usually comes with a bill attached. And if this reciprocity is not met, you get hurt or the other person gets hurt, and the transaction stops and you stop becoming friends. Honey, we've invited those people over for dinner 5 times and they haven't invited us once. Let's just give it up. And a lot of that is social normalcy. And so I'm not condemning it, because this is our transactions, both emotional, social, and financial, are kind of what enable human society to function. But there's a kind of dishonesty in saying, well, I'm being really loving in a kind of true Christian sense when I've got all sorts of riders attached to it. And I think that confusion is also the cause of great unhappiness.
And with love, obviously there's different types, as they say in the Greek way, there's 7 types, but you're talking about in your books, the sort of the unconditional love, the divine love.
Yeah. As C.S. Lewis indicated in his book, The 4 Loves, the Greek has 4 words for love. Without going into all of those, I would break them down into 2. There are 3 types that are transactional: romantic, friendship, and family love. Those are transactional. All of those are transactional. If you don't think your family love is transactional, I'm very sorry, you're wrong, and you'll be very hurt to find out otherwise. In fact, a great deal of bitterness in the families is precisely because this truth is not known or not admitted, right? And then there's agape, which is unconditional love. The expression I use to translate it is conscious love, again, coming from Gurdjieff. And I believe quite strongly that Gurdjieff had this agape in mind when he talked about conscious love. I mean, Gurdjieff was half Greek, so he spoke Greek perfectly well. And I believe that's kind of what he's talking about. And it evokes the same, because it's genuinely caring. It's genuine. It actually is, as Gurdjieff says, externally considering, right? It actually has some idea of what the other person might actually want, rather than what would make you look like a good person, or might get you to get them to do something nice for you next time around. And I think that is kind of the heart of agape, conscious love, external considering. And it's important to be clear about these differences. The Course in Miracles puts it another way. It calls what I call transactional love the special relationship. And it's basically, shall we say, a deal done between two or more egos. And this is most of our social interaction. And then there's what it calls the holy relationship, which goes beyond this. It talks about the holy relationship in often in terms of what it calls the holy instant, almost as if this kind of relationship is only possible in the actual present moment, you know, when you're actually with someone and you're actually interacting with them, rather than, you know, kind of your field of dreams and illusions about them.
Well, with talking about the transactional love, this is kind of what Christ as Jesus came to give everybody, wasn't it? Like the Old Testament God was a bit of an angry, annoying God, annoyed with us God, where Jesus has turned up and said, well, my Father's changed now, and it's about love, and he wants you all to love.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Old Testament, you know, at least as conventionally portrayed, is about law, and the law is always quid pro quo. It's not just the Jewish law. It could be even brought to a much broader context by saying the law is what the Hindus call dharma. Now, dharma has a lot of meanings in Hinduism, but in one sense it means law in the sense of universal law, the law of the universe. If human law, according to Hinduism, is at all correct, it is in accordance with this universal law. But even this dharma, this universal law, is rather merciless, because what is it? It's based on karma. And karma is, well, let's put it this way, a like cause produces a like result. You're generally bouncing back on you. If you kill somebody, you're going to get killed later on. Maybe this life, maybe next. So it's actually merciless, you know, and it's quite as harsh in its own way as the jealous God of the Old Testament as conventionally portrayed. It just is. It's the law. It's the law of gravity. If you break the law of gravity, you will have consequences. The law of gravity is not getting mad at you. The law of gravity is not a jealous God. It's just kind of the way it is. Similarly, with this dharma, this way the universe works as we know it, there's no way out of it as from its own level. And this, what I think Christ is talking about, is going past this dharma, this law, as the Apostle Paul understood. And in fact, the law of karma has its own little escape clause, because although it's utterly rigorous, utterly merciless, in the context of this relative plane of being that we're in, there is only one way out of it. And it's in the Lord's Prayer: forgive us our debts as we have forgiven our debtors. Because if you apply the law of karma, if you're forgiven, you're entitled to forgiveness as well. That's kind of the way out of it. And the way I quoted it just now, forgive us our debts as we have forgiven our debtors, is a correct translation of the Greek of the New Testament. That second verb is a aorist verb, to be technical about it, which can be translated as the past or the perfect tense in English. It's have forgiven, or as we forgave others. It's not this kind of exchange of hostages. You, in a sense, have to do it first. And that is the only thing that's going to set the law of karma on its head. That's the only way out. So, and I think those are some of the key messages that Christianity in its best and truest form was meant to impart.
That's amazing. I really like that. Thank you, Richard. Never thought of it like that before. That's fantastic. That was so good that I forgot what my next question was going to be, because I was like, this is, because I've always loved the Lord's Prayer myself. I try to recite it, you know, when I can, as often as I can. but now I shall have to look at that part differently when I'm saying it and make sure I'm getting that correct.
Yeah, and there are other little oddities. Deliver us from evil. The word for there is paneros, which doesn't really mean evil. It means, its root meaning, it's burdensome, troublesome, sick, sick in the physical sense. And so it's not the devil, it's not the troublesome one. What is the troublesome one? It's the ego. As Course in Miracles, the ego is the part of the mind that decided it wanted to live without God or to see what that was like. And at the fact that it entertained this thought, it became terrified, because the thought is terrifying. And it went into this shock. And this shock is kind of what all of the world we cognize is generated. And so that is the troublesome one. It's not the devil. Although, if you want to go talk about the devil a little bit, it is, the Greek word again is diabolos, which literally means accuser. And one feature of the ego is that it's always accusing. It's never my fault, it's your fault. The hallmark an ego-driven person is, it's never my fault. I never did anything wrong to you. They will lie. They will deny what they said 5 minutes ago. But if you're that vested in the ego, that is what you're going to do. And yeah, you could say it's wicked. It's troublesome. It's troublesome, especially for you. So I think that's another dimension of the Lord's Prayer. So it's not just like this cosmic, devil, who makes you, vomit green milkshakes and in those horror movies, but it's a constant part of ourselves that we have to be aware of and watch.
Like our dark side, our dark shadow would be
Yeah.
the union. Because the ego, I think, is a bit intimidated by love.
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, in Miracles, it talks about the ego as kind of a cosmic force. It's not really, when we talk about the ego, generally speaking, we're talking about the ordinary street level personality. My ego versus your ego. That's not really what the Course is saying. The ego is kind of this primordial force of dissociation. If you're familiar with the Gnostic tradition, it is probably or can be equated with the demiurge, this kind of second-rate deity that fabricates a world. And the second-rate deity is not some god up there, as is often visualized in people's conceptions of the Gnostic teachings, but it is this cognitive structure, this faulty cognitive structure that causes us to apprehend the world in the way we do, which is fundamentally fearful.
Yes. I find the Gnostic texts quite fascinating, actually. I've been looking at them for the last few years, and about how we have to bring in, or hopefully Sophia will come and give us the intelligence to see through the demiurge. And again, it's down to love, isn't it? Love is what suffocates it, I suppose, or calms it down, so that we can then hopefully go through that and see the divine.
Yeah.
Or not see the divine, but reach further into the divine.
Exactly. Yes. The Gnostic texts are fascinating, and I have to say, it strikes me as very, very hard to believe that one is really understanding what they were talking about, because they are not newspaper articles, they're not philosophical treatises. They're most of them are very, very cryptic texts that very, very likely were meant to be used in a teaching context. The student who learned it, and the teacher, whoever the teacher was, expounded it and what it really meant and how it related to you. And because this, shall we say, living tradition hasn't really survived in any recognizable form, the texts seem very opaque, although they're also very evocative.
Well, another opaque one is William Blake, who you bring into your book as well. I'm a big fan of William Blake myself, and his ideas of love and the different loves. Would you like to speak a little bit about William Blake?
I know a bit about Blake. I don't understand his entire cosmology, which is very unique and very personal. But he certainly one thing that resonates with me of his is the book of Urizen. Or how is it pronounced? Urizen?
Well, some people say Urizen, and then when I went to the Blake Society, they were saying to me, Urizen, it's meant to be your reason, because it is reason, isn't it? And I thought that was interesting.
Well, it's like well, it's a kind of pun that James Joyce would later imitate in Finnegan's Wake, because it evokes the Greek orizein, meaning to limit.
Mm-hmm.
The source of our word horizon, your reason, as you pointed out, or if you pronounce it Urizen, your eyes. All of those, I think, are evoked in that, and all of those are part of it. You know, there's a theme, and I think Blake says it, perhaps even in so many words, of, you know, seeing what the body sees is illusory, or what our normal vision is, you know, the kind of darkness. And if we could see truly, we could see everything as it is in its purity. So Blake too is saying that this cognition, our ordinary way of looking at the world, is somehow defective. And he may well have gotten this from the Gnostics. He did seem to have some familiarity with their teachings. He also was kind of introduced to this whole thing by Swedenborg, who's also spoke of a kind of spiritual vision by which your eyes are open and you're seeing another world. Although later I think he got impatient with Swedenborg and kind of broke with him and even started to make fun of him. I mean, you will, Swedenborg has these long commentaries on the Bible, and he sometimes inserts memorable discourses, you know, which involve little experiences of his own. And Blake, of course, made fun of that by writing down memorable fancies. It was obviously kind of a jab, but still, he got a lot out of Swedenborg, even though, as you know, sometimes you get enough out of someone and you go off on your own way. That's natural.
Well, Swedenborg was another one who said that Jesus came to him like the lady with the Course in Miracles, which is, you know.
Yeah. Well, Swedenborg's vision is very powerful, and I've read a certain amount of it. I used to be on the board of the Swedenborg Foundation until I realized I just didn't have time for it. But it's very powerful. It is very much of his time, and I think my own view of Swedenborg is that he was given as much as that time could digest. That was about as far as people were going to be able to take it in the 18th century. I would say A Course in Miracles represents a kind of advance on it. It's a more refined and sophisticated view of all this. But I think Swedenborg's revelation was genuine, and it was transformative. He really, well, he really, in his own way, inaugurated the New Age, and the New Age, as which he said was going to be characterized by the Latin nunc licet. Now it is permitted. Now it is permitted to see into mysteries that were formerly closed. And that was, he said this happened as of 1757, which was a year of, he said, the Last Judgment in heaven. It never was supposed to take place here. It's not going to take place here. Jesus is not going to come down and yank everybody out of their cars and up into the sky. That was never what it was meant to be. It was meant to be this kind of spiritual clearing. And once that took place, which it did according to him, now there's a lot more room for freedom and inquiry. The shackles of religion in its worst forms had pretty much been broken, and they're there. They're not going away. They'll be there as long as anyone wants them, which some people do.
But I think also with that, I agree with that as well, because we had the age of Pisces, so we had the teachers to come and show us the way, like Jesus, you know, Buddha, etc. And now we're going to the age of Aquarius, which is about us as individuals going forward. You know, we don't really need the organized religions. We should be finding it ourselves.
Yeah, and you see that. I mean, I would say that we're basically, for all intents and purposes, we are in the age of Aquarius. the age of Pisces is over. I mean, there are no exact breaks of its kind. There are holdovers and overlaps. But a lot of things that we see, particularly over the last 20 years, like the revolutionization of technology, this kind of, and this kind of desire for my truth, my own autonomous truth, is very Aquarian. Aquarius, on its not so nice side, is characterized by, that expression, I love humanity, it's people I can't stand. There's this kind of impersonal love of humanity, but it's also, it sometimes is a bit clinical and cold in interpersonal reactions. And that's certainly what we're seeing today. Enormous amounts of idealism. How can we help the world? How can we save all of these people everywhere? And, on a day-to-day basis, people are perhaps as much or more mechanical than they used to be.
Well, with your book, A Theology of Love, which I think is very apt for this time, especially now with the lockdowns happening across the world, maybe this is the time when people need to be looking at the theology of love, not necessarily your book, but looking at what love is, how to get themselves through this, is difficult times at the moment.
Yeah, well, of course, I hope they will also look at my book, but I agree with you certainly in principle. And I mean, notice that this is a time when everything that was completely normal has completely reversed itself. To go into astrology for a moment, I remember saying to my wife on New Year's, we're not going to recognize the world next New Year's Day, and that's already true. 3 months into the year, astrologically, and I don't know how much you follow astrologically, there is a conjunction of Saturn and Pluto in Capricorn on January, which was exact on January 12th, and the astrologers all knew something big was coming. They knew something big and explosive like that was coming. None of them, to my knowledge, predicted the virus as such, because astrology isn't really that specific, but they could all detect the weather patterns. And so in one sense, surprise, but they knew something was coming, although they didn't know how it would come or what would come. So it's a time of great upheaval. And you could say another time upheaval astrologically will come on December 21st, which there'll be a grand conjunction. That is the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter, the two outermost planets as known to classical astrology, in the sign of Aquarius. And these happen every 20 years. The last one happened in May 2000. In the United States, it was correlated with the dot-com bust. There's a huge rise and then down. But for the last 200 years, it has taken place in earth signs, because that's just kind of the way things work. And this will be the first time it happens in an air sign.
All right, that's interesting.
Centuries. So it is going to mark both of these in their own kind of way are marking a turning of the age. Things will be very different. Will they be better? Will they be worse? Well, probably in some ways better, some ways probably worse. It's very hard to say, but this is a time of enormous transition. And, the coronavirus is its current manifestation. But I think everybody realizes now that, even if the thing went away next week, things would never really return quite to the way they were. The world has changed irrevocably and in ways we still can't predict.
Yes, who knows where it's going.
And this is a time when what you have to ask yourself, what are you worth? What are you worth? I mean, are you going to be like another chicken with its head cut off, running around the walls, and or are you going to be a point of light, of stability, of reason, of soundness? This is, what is it, Thomas Paine? These are the times that try men's souls. And certainly it's true time of the American Revolution. It's certainly true now. We just have to ask ourselves, where are we going to be? What are we going to stand for? I mean that quite individually. What am I going to be? What am I going to stand for? And every person has to ask that question, I think, for themselves.
Yes, indeed, because there seems to be a lot of herd mentality, obviously, in the world, and that's why I wanted to do these podcasts, because I know there are people looking for, they don't want to be part of that herd, but maybe they don't know what to do or how to feel, and I don't want them to be put down by what's going on with the fear mongering and the media.
Well, you know, I mean, in a time when people are losing their heads, the number one task is for you not to lose your head. I mean, of course, it's difficult because everybody's asking. I mean, I just see, you know, all sorts of nonsense on Facebook. These are friends of mine. They're ostensibly intelligent, educated people, but, you know, I just feel a lot of just, you know, just hysteria. And I think for myself, I have to say, well, how do I not get in this phase either of just oblivious denial or hysterical panic? I mean, you know, as Aristotle said, virtue is always a mean, you know, between hysterical panic and utter denial. And I have to ask myself, you know, on a daily basis, well, what does that mean for me, like right now? I think many people probably are asking themselves that, or should be asking themselves that, minimally.
Well, in this day of awakening, I'd like to thank you, Richard, very much for doing this show. And your book's available. Do you have your own website?
Yes, it's called innerchristianity.com. And it has more on my books on it. And my books are available from all of the usual sources online and I hope in bookstores. So I hope people will read it. It's called A Theology of Love, Reimagining Christianity Through A Course in Miracles.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. And I hope we can do this again, because I did enjoy talking to you.
Well, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your questions, and I really very much enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you, Richard.